food for thought to digest through the day. So it's great to see such a strong turnout, and I suspect that may have something to do with our exciting guest speaker that we have with us this afternoon. So we got a fairly mind-boggling presentation from you this morning, Sir Robert, that covered an awful lot of material because it was so integrative in nature. There were social and ecological dimensions, economic dimensions, at all sorts of spatial and temporal scales. You were trying to look at the whole world in a UK context and bring all that together in a way that could make sense to policymakers. And it's certainly been a theme over the last couple of days about how we make sense of complexity and how we translate that complexity into meaningful action, particularly in the policy context, but also in the business strategy context. The session this afternoon is about the science policy interface. So to start off, can I ask you, Bob, to give us a few thoughts that you might have about how you make the science and policy interface work better and work effectively at both national and international scale? What are the key challenges and issues around the science policy interface, and how do we do it better?
Yes, thank you. Let me start by saying what I see some of the really big challenges are. The big environmental challenges include stratospheric ozone depletion, which, as you've heard at this meeting, we've quite successfully dealt with. A good interface between science, policy and government and the private sector. So the issues are stratospheric ozone depletion, potentially causing skin cancer in light-skinned people. The climate change issue, of course, biodiversity, ecosystem degradation, agriculture and sustainable agriculture, energy, water. So they're the big issues, some of the big issues that we have to think about from an environmental perspective. Why do we care about them? Well, yes, they are key environmental issues, but more important to me, or as important, they are not only environmental issues, they're development issues, they're security issues, they're economic issues. They impact on society of food security, water security, human health, etc. So the challenge to improve decision making, whether it's in government or in the private sector, is good knowledge, not just data, knowledge. Therefore, we need really robust national research programs and internationally coordinated research programs. So the basis is knowledge. It needs to be inter and multidisciplinary, as we've heard here. Natural science, social science, economics, engineering, law, business, all play a key role in this. We then, of course, need to assess the knowledge in the sense that there are thousands and thousands of papers generated every day, every week from the scientific community. Some are right, some are rubbish, and therefore the assessment process, whether it's at the national or international level, is absolutely crucial. So there are international assessments on ozone. I chaired most of them for about 20 years. There's the climate change assessments, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. On biodiversity, we've had the Global Biodiversity Assessment, we've had the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, now we have the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, which I'm one of the vice chairs. I recently directed an international agricultural assessment, and of course, I was not at all involved in the global energy assessment, and there are others. So the assessment process, whether it's the international level, the ones I've just mentioned, or at the national level, like I talked about this morning, the National Ecosystem Assessment, absolutely vital to synthesize and assess the knowledge. What's crucial is when you're putting one of these assessments together, is to make sure that you not only have the best experts in the country or the world assessing that knowledge, but you've listened to the end users. You've listened to effectively the private sector. What knowledge do they need? You've listened to government. What knowledge do they need for policy formulation and implementation? You've listened to the NGO community or the local farmers. So the idea is we must both do our research programs and our assessment programs in a transdisciplinary manner where the end users are involved in the design and the implementation of the research programs and of the international assessments. Now, in the big issues of climate change, biodiversity, etc., we've got conventions. The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Convention on Biological Diversity, the Convention to Combat Desertification, CITES, Ramsar, the Wetlands Convention, etc., migratory species. So we've got a good way at the international level of making sure that the knowledge is not only the knowledge that needs to be assessed, there's automatically a customer for it. And therefore, my argument is assessments should no longer be driven by the scientific community. They must be demand-driven, not supply-driven. You need to make sure that the full range of stakeholders that are important in the process are involved in designing the process, designing the scope, and are part of the process. So when the results finally come out, they know the process is legitimate, that it's credible, that the knowledge is peer-reviewed and high quality, and then they're likely to use it. So on the national assessment I did this, that I talked about this morning, I had a user group, as I mentioned, of end users from the private sector, of end users from government, local to national, and the NGO local community. So I think one of the challenges is that to improve the science policy interface, the scientists must work hand in glove, but be independent of, I do stress be independent of, the end users. And so I think the question is then, how do you actually do that? I don't find it difficult. Most of the big international assessments have not been organized that way. The only international assessment that was organized in a truly, what I call multi-stakeholder way, was the international assessment I directed on agriculture, where I put an advisory bureau together of 60 people, 30 governments from around the world, from Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, Asia, OECD countries. I had 30 members of civil society. I had farmers, the big seed companies. I had consumers. I had indigenous groups, etc. To make sure that when we finalized our agricultural assessment, we had buy-in to the results and to the process. It was by far the most difficult assessment I've ever been involved in, and the reason is you have to be evidence-based, and with the agriculture issue, there are three very big ideological issues. One is genetic modification, second is international trade, and the third is just agricultural chemicals. Way harder than anything we dealt with in climate change, where the most important issue that was sensitive was nuclear power. These other issues in agriculture are way more ideological than even nuclear power under climate change. And within biodiversity, yes, there's a lot of views, but there wasn't a big contentious issue that was ideological. So very straightforward. We need good research programs, good assessment programs. We need to work with decision makers, and that's now playing out in New York. I actually still represent the UK government on the Sustainable Development Goals, where the key to sustainable development is poverty eradication, based on good evidence. But the definition of poverty includes income, food security, water security, energy security, human health, education, looking at equality issues, gender issues, governance issues, youth issues, decent jobs, and many other. So I think what we're moving towards is a world that recognizes sustainable development is important, and it's very, very multifaceted, and the environment is an issue that can no longer be viewed as an environmental issue. It's a development issue, it's a social issue, and it's an economic issue.
Many of these international collaborative efforts that you've been involved with, these international assessments, have produced some pretty big red warning lights for humanity. And then when we come down to the national scale, sometimes it feels like you're living in a different reality. They're not translating through, the message isn't necessarily getting through. Why do you think there's that disconnect between the international discourse and what happens at national government level?
I think it varies, actually. I don't think one can say it does or does not translate. On climate change, for example, it really did affect all European countries in the European Union. In fact, their policies are far in excess of any other countries in the world. It affected the UK. The way it affected the UK is we have a Climate Change Act in the UK now that legislatively says that the UK should reduce its emissions by 80% by 2050. And there are stepping stones along the way for 2020, 2035, and 2050. So the IPCC had a profound effect on policy formulation at the national level in the UK and within Europe. It did affect scientific research in the United States, but it hasn't affected policy in the United States. The Millennium Ecosystem Assessment that I was the board co-chair immediately had an impact in the UK because Parliament immediately said, we want to look at this at the national level. That's why we had the UK National Ecosystem Assessment. A week after the National Ecosystem Assessment came out, we had a white paper, which is a strategy document on biodiversity. So there are some examples where the international processes, like IPCC, the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, profoundly affected, at least in the UK, their thinking across all parties of what did it mean to the UK. Now, the assessments I first started, all the ones on stratospheric ozone depletion, and they were by far the most successful ever. We had research, we did an assessment, and we've got the Montreal Protocol. 3 years later, we had the London Amendments, then we had the Copenhagen Amendments, then I forget what the other sequence was. But I've never seen anything before where it went from scientific knowledge to an assessment process to action on the ground at an international level, which influenced all countries in the world. So I think there's good examples where it's worked, and there's a lot of examples where it doesn't work. The climate debate is a very complex one. It's to do with large-scale economics. There are social issues, economic issues, technology issues, and the big issue is equity. And the question is, who's caused the problem? Largely industrialized world, if not almost exclusively. Who's likely to be the biggest contributor to change in the future? Many of the emerging economies, such as India, China, Brazil, Mexico, South Africa, etc. So there's who caused the problem? What's your responsibility for historical emissions? Who's causing the problem in the future? The other debate there that makes it really complex is, how did the industrialized world get rich? We use cheap fossil fuels. We're now telling developing countries not to use their fossil fuels. And we largely transformed our landscapes into agricultural landscapes. And what are we now telling Brazil, the Congo, Papua New Guinea? Don't lose your biodiversity. And so one has to put in context where we are on the socio-political system, economic system, etc. So these are the research and the assessments are critical. We have to make sure they talk to each country individually, but not only to governments, but to the private sector and to society at large.
Fantastic, thank you. Can I ask how it is that we can drive demand for uncomfortable knowledge?
I'm not sure quite what I would call uncomfortable knowledge. What I would argue is we have to identify what types of knowledge are needed. Now, the scientific community has got a very good idea of what we know and what we don't know, and it has a good idea of how to bring forward new advances in knowledge, whether it's in natural sciences, social sciences, economics, or all together, and of course in engineering, in other key fields. But as I say, we do also need to understand from the private sector, from governments, what knowledge they think they also need. As Al Gore said in his book and in his film, there are some inconvenient truths. Therefore, for government, once they've commissioned research, under no circumstances should they ever censor it. And sometimes when research is funded by government, and the research that the results that are coming out, some of this is uncomfortable for government. It shows a previous policy is wrong, or the direction of travel of policy is wrong. And it's very hard sometimes for governments to admit, we were wrong, we need to have a new policy going in a new direction. So the crucial thing is to make sure that there is an independence of both the research and the assessment process, that it is not censored in any way. And so some people would argue, why in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change or the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services that's just been started, why are governments so heavily involved? I strongly support governments being involved. We must have them involved. They have expertise in their own right, but they should not have any ability to censor the final documents. So it's the scientific community working with governments, working with the private sector, working with the NGOs to find out what does that knowledge mean. And clearly, knowledge is a necessary but not sufficient condition for informed policy formulation. There are many factors that go into a decision, whether it's on climate change, whether it's on biodiversity and how we manage our land, of which we as scientists can help inform the decision, but there are many political aspects that a minister or head of state has to also take into account.
Fantastic. Let's take a question or two. Has anyone out there got a question they'd like to put forward?
One over here, couple over here.
Come on down.
Somebody should take the opportunity. We've heard a lot from business folk here in the panel before about profit and profitability. My question really is, do we have to change the business model? Because profit, and I guess we could throw interest and we could throw dividends. We could throw anyone who's got a KiwiSaver investment that they think they're going to get in their old age there. If we keep aiming for profit, we're looking at presumably purchasing more goods and services with the profit, and therefore we're chewing more into the planet. What's your thoughts on a business model that is some kind of a status quo?
Yes, I'm not an expert on this, but I would argue that profit is a motivator for the private sector. It has to be. But I think the question is, and we heard it from some of the panelists earlier today, it needs to be profit that is socially responsible, environmentally responsible. And I see that as a movement to some degree of some of the big multinationals, that they are realizing that it is in their own self-interest for long-term profits to recognize social responsibility and to realize environmental limits and the environmental issues. So I personally don't have any problem with the concept of profit. We need to be quite candid, the private sector, to be innovative in new technologies, new business models. We need them certainly to be innovative in the health sphere, so they come up with new drugs to attack the issues of cancer, heart disease, etc. And so I have no problem with a profit motivation as long as they take into account social and environmental considerations. Equally, I also believe that growth, economic growth across the world is important. We have 1 billion people today still live under $1 a day. 1 billion people under $1 a day. We have over 1 billion people go to bed hungry. We have 1 billion people that have no clean water, no access to modern energy. We need economic growth. I have no problem with that construct, but it has to be sustainable economic growth, taking into consideration the so-called externalities of how the growth model affects the environment and affects social issues such as equity, equality, etc. So I think it's a question of how you make profit and how you have growth. So one has to rethink how we do sustainable production, sustainable use.
The supplementary question, with apologies, is if you work it out backwards, how many people can the planet sustain and at what level? Is your approach the right one?
It's a question. No, and I think this is where society has to look at this. Am I too much of an optimist? And it's a good question, actually. It was said in the previous panel, we have to reduce our energy intensity. I'm not sure I agree. We absolutely must reduce our carbon intensity, but if all of our energy could come from renewable energy, then I'm not convinced we have to reduce our energy intensity of us. We must work on end use efficiency. whether it's in industry, transportation, or housing. So we must work on energy use efficiency, and we must work on making the energy carbon-free. I'm personally convinced we can make it carbon-free. If we can, then I don't actually have to worry so much about energy intensity over the next 100 or so years. So I think I also believe we can become much more sustainable on water, but we have to use it much more efficiently than we do today. We need to price it. We should never waste a scarce resource. And there's easy ways to price water, not to make it a market commodity, but have some price to it with social safety nets, so the poorest people in the world get so much water free. Everyone needs clean water for drinking, for cooking. But then as you use more and more water, you start to put a price on it. So I think we have to think all of these things through about our natural resources. To what degree is there a human right to food, to water, etc.? And there is. But how can you also make sure we don't waste a scarce resource? And that's the debate we all need to have.
Yesterday, you and I were talking about the fact that as we've introduced more energy efficient appliances, and we were talking about LED lighting, the tendency is to put 5-6 times more lights in your house. And so the more efficient we get, as Jeff Mulgan pointed out recently, the more efficient our production gets, the more inefficient we get in our consumption. And our living standards actually come to be defined by our inefficiencies. How big our houses are, how many homes we have, how many cars we have, etc., etc. Have you got any thoughts about how we curb the excesses?
I mean, in some ways, some of mine are excesses. I mean, I realize the issue. I've got a much larger house than I probably need. Between my partner, Marianne, and I, we have 2 cars. Can we do away with one? There is no mass transportation anywhere near where we live, and we live very close to downtown Washington, D.C., so transportation is a key issue. So I think city planning is crucial. And in Europe, which is where I spent the last 5 years in London, superb mass transportation. You don't even want to own a car in London. In fact, I didn't have a car for 5 years when I lived in England. Mass transport worked well for me. I don't know, we need behavior change. We have to link how are individual habits affecting the planet, and think through that if I have a large car or a large house, or I eat a lot of meat, what are the implications for my own human health, which is a factor, and how does it affect the planet? So what individuals need is not to be told what to do, but given the information that this lifestyle is either good or bad for your health, but this lifestyle is also good or bad for the planet. We have to let people be part of a conversation to make appropriate decisions, basically. But it's clear, if you go to end-use efficiency, and if all the cars suddenly were twice as efficient tomorrow morning, most people would drive them, maybe not twice as much, but significantly more than they do. So there's a rebound effect that we need to look at very carefully. But clearly, efficient use of all resources, especially scarce resources, is absolutely critical.
There's another question up there.
Thank you. I've got a question about your National Ecosystem Assessment in the UK and the white paper. I lived in the UK for 20 years and I miss the speed with which they produce white papers over there. The thing that struck me from your presentation was the idea that you need to implement policy at a very refined, small, spatial scale. And I was wondering what feedback you've had from the UK government on how they might change the way they implement government regulations to try and take on board that small spatial scale.
Yes, in the first National Ecosystem Assessment that came out about 18 months ago, which was followed literally within only 7 days, literally 7 days, with the white paper. So they were done in parallel. So as we developed our knowledge base, our assessment, I allowed government, all departments, not just DEFRA, who came up with the strategy, but all government departments, including Treasury, Department of Energy and Climate Change, DFID, the International Development Agency, etc. We let them have the non-peer-reviewed results, telling them they might change after peer review. So as they developed their strategy, they had the latest thinking that they had to refine as we refined our documents. Now, in that particular assessment, we noted that a policy that was blanket across the UK was good for maybe much of the UK, but not all places. And we did note that you needed spatial disaggregation of policies. The second phase, which we're now doing, which I'm also co-chairing, the follow-on phase, we're making a really big point of that. So a little bit of the work I showed you this morning has only just been finished. In fact, the chapters were only finished last week, and they've actually now gone up for heavy peer review. So this message about spatial planning, with our ability to show how to do it, for example, if you want to plant more forest, what is the best way to get maximum benefit for planting so many hectares per year, where you can take into account water quality, market value, recreational value. That's really going to be the message of the second assessment report, but it will also feed right into the government through the National Capital Committee. So it's too early to say how it will be used. What I would say is there is a slight dilemma in the UK. They don't believe, and I have no problem with it, with top-down spatial planning at the national level. They really do believe in local planning. So I think one of the challenges, how to use the tools that we've developed for national scale planning, but recognizing you have to have a lot of bottom-up planning as well. And I think it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out, to be quite honest.
Good afternoon. I work for the Department of Conservation as a technical advisor on marine ecosystems, and an area that I'm working quite a lot on at the moment is estuarine systems. My question is around dealing with complexity, and also there's a scale element in this which follows on a bit from the previous question. You'll be aware of a paper by Costanza et al. In 1997. And of course, their paper is at a global scale, but they use a similar approach that you had earlier in your talk, using categories. So they broke up the Earth's habitats, biomes, ecosystems into categories, and then they assessed how much ecosystem services are coming from those various categories. So my question really is around the use of these categories and how we can kind of chunk off bits of our environment so that we can deal with that complexity. So in the Costanza report, they had a category marine, as you did as well, but they further broke that down into coastal section and also estuarine. They had calculated that 61% of all the ecosystem services came from those marine and coastal components. And the estuarine particularly, even though it made up 0.35% of the global area, contributed 12.4% of all global ecosystem services. So estuaries, from that report I took it that they are a real place to get bangs for bucks if you want to look at ecosystem services. They're also under a lot of threats. When I looked at your categories, you had marine, you had coastal margins, you had freshwater and wetlands grouped together. Costanza had freshwater, lakes and rivers as a category, and they had wetlands separate. They also had estuaries as separate. So my question really is, what methods did you use to determine your categories, and how might you apply categories in different scales and different countries?
Yes, clearly there is no perfect way of splitting up the ecosystems. We decided to go with 8. That was largely based on what the experts thought the appropriate habitat selection was, and also how it's almost managed in the UK. So people manage rivers and lakes, people manage farmlands, people manage the mountains and the moors. So we looked to see, to some degree, what did the scientific community think was a logical breakdown of our habitats, and effectively how were they managed in a policy context. So there is indeed some debate to exactly how you do it. There is no right way to do it, there's no wrong way to do it. And in fact, I would argue, in our first national ecosystem assessment, we looked very carefully at status and trends of all of the systems you've just mentioned, coastal, estuaries, rivers, lakes, etc. And as I pointed out in my slide earlier today, in many respects, these are the systems that are still in some respects declining in quality. They are not improving to the degree that we want them to, like the woodland system. But what we have done in the second phase is we put far more effort on some of the value and valuation issues with respect to these aquatic systems. And Kerry Turner from the University of East Anglia has led a package which is called Package 3B, really looking at these systems. They're very complex because you can't look at a river system or an estuary system without looking to see what's happening in the land. They're driven by land-based pollution more than anything else. And so even when we came up with our 8 habitats, and we tended to look at them a little bit in isolation, what we've realized and trying to do more and more in the second phase is what's the interaction across the different habitats, and in particular in the water habitats, you have to look at the relationship of land-based pollution into the rivers, into the lakes, the way the rivers flow into the estuaries, into the coastal margins, and how the coastal margins affects the oceans. So I think every country needs to think through, for New Zealand, how would you break it up? Would you have 8 habitats, 6 habitats, or 12? There's no right and wrong answer. It's what do your scientific community think is the best breakdown, and how will that play out to the end users, the policymakers in government, or the water utility companies, etc. So as I say, I think this is where we had a conversation between users and the scientific community of what was the logical way to break up our habitats. But in the end, we could have broken it up in a different way. We certainly didn't want hundreds of habitats. We decided to just go with 8, but recognize there are 8 interlinkages between them.
Great, thank you.
Another question up there?
Good afternoon. I just had a question that I was interested to hear from you regarding your talk this morning. You talked about the conceptual framework for the UK NEA, and you had this kind of diagram which went drivers of change, direct, indirect, and then you went to future scenarios, ecosystem services, goods, human well-being, and then you had the social feedback loop. And it just occurred to me that as you went through your talk, you had a table with those categories there, and it seemed to me, certainly in something that comes up in New Zealand, is the missing element possibly was, maybe it's buried in there, is the political feedback loop. So perhaps that's meant to be part of the social feedback, but for us as a small country, we're very concerned about where we are on the world stage and where we can make a difference for New Zealand. And so our ability to leverage at the international level and be seen to be doing the right thing to promote our clean green image or whatever it is really important to us. But that didn't come through so much in your presentation. I was wondering if you had a comment.
It's a very good point. There's many ways you can draw that conceptual framework. It's actually a variant of what we did for the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. Lots of people would do it quite differently. And so we actually took it, and with the Millennium Ecosystem, it was very, very similar, except more emphasis on poverty, just because we looked at it globally and there is a lot of poverty. There's another big program that's that's happening, which is called Future Earth. Not an assessment process, it's a research program. What we've done, I was on the transition team of how to put this together. We looked at all the 4 and I'll come to you specifically in a second. We looked at all the big international programs, the World Climate Research Program, which as it says looks at climate. We looked at Diversitas, which looked at biodiversity issues. We looked at the International Human Dimensions Program, social program, and we looked at the International Geosphere Biosphere Program, which talks about the geosphere and the biosphere. We've integrated those 4 together, and we've actually come up with a conceptual framework. Boy, there were these frameworks that were so damn complex, looked like a spider's diagram. I argued to all the scientists that level of complexity would never communicate to anyone. So actually, they've got one that's very, very similar. Drivers, environmental change, all forms of environmental change, and human well-being. But in the middle, we put a big blob called transformations. And that is, how do you get policy transformation? How do you get behavioral transformation? How do you look at technological transformation? And within that is the socio-political system. But within drivers, as I said, the indirect drivers are demographic, not just numbers of people, but are they in the urban area? Are they in the rural area? It's family size. It's lots of issues under demography. Age distribution comes in. We look then, of course, at the economic drivers, and it's not just the rate of change of economic growth, but it's how does the market work, etc. How do we look at trade? How do we look at subsidies? But it's also the social political system is a major driver, and that's embedded in it. So the political part is typically buried within our drivers and how the political system can change the drivers. That's how we've tried to embed the political dimensions. But again, you could draw it out very differently. And one might want to draw out a bit more the political system, but I like the way we've done it under Future Earth, where we've put transformations in the middle, and drivers are actually both on the outside and in the middle, because that's where the political process can affect the whole system by what are their policies on education, on jobs, on the economy, on trade, on development of technologies, etc. So maybe we should make it more explicit. It's more implicit in our framework.
I guess my only comment would be is that maybe that would work within a country, but when it comes to international policy, that may not translate across quite so well. So engaging the politicians as opposed to the policy makers, because the politicians quite frequently don't listen to the policy makers, don't listen to the evidence, and a lot of it is to do with the way in which it's presented. And so I'm just thinking that to make that connection, it may be something we need to factor in and, at our starting point. So knowledge, data, information is all useful, but it's the way in which it carries right through. So it's not just about well-being or looking after the environment, but it's also the way the political animal works and how we can actually make progress in that area too.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's why in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and that's why in the new Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, governments and the political process is completely embedded in there. So on IPCC, it is an independent scientific process with thousands of scientists involved, and I do mean the full range of scientists, but within an intergovernmental process of governments. Well over 100 governments now are full members of the IPCC, so the political process is embedded within the IPCC. It then feeds in to the convention process that is totally and utterly political, basically. And so politics is both, so the assessment processes are independent of politics at one level, but fully embedded within a political process.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying, but at the same time, not a lot's happening with climate change. Everyone's dithering around and not making decisions on a global basis, or at a national basis. So it's not necessarily feeding through in the way that perhaps it should be.
Oh, it feeds through. I think the question is, people say, the UN system's broken. Look, we can't get America to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions. We need another system. I don't know of a system that could make the US do what it doesn't want to do. I don't know of a system that could make China do what it doesn't want to do, or New Zealand to do what it wants to do. And in fact, you can look at New Zealand, Australia, and Canada, and depending on the political party in power, their views on things like climate change can oscillate from one extreme to another. One interesting thing in both Germany and the UK, for the last 25 years, there's been a totally consistent climate policy in both Germany and the UK, totally independent of political power. Totally unusual. In almost every other country in the world, it's a political football. So the knowledge is feeding through, but knowledge is only one part of the political process.
Mary, you'll be
That's enough from me.
You'll be pleased to know that the Natural Resources Policy Framework that will be launched next month has a fifth dimension alongside economic, social, cultural, and environmental, or ecological, and that is a political dimension, which we've particularly picked up on from our research as being important, particularly issues around transparency, legitimacy, accountability. Those sort of dimensions are very important to our policy development consideration.
Yeah, in fact, one quick question I could comment on that. In this negotiation of what should sustainable development goals be, they are a follow-on to the Millennium Development Goals, where the Millennium Development Goals only apply to developing countries, and there were 8 of them, as most of you know, such as poverty alleviation, hunger alleviation. There were 3 on human health, there was 1 on education, there was 1 on the environment, there was 1 on partnerships. In the debate, as we're debating in New York, there are thematic issues like food, water, and energy security. There are spatial issues such as cities, but the cross-cutting issues are absolutely central. And one of the most important that's being talked about is what is good governance? Not only in governments, but in the private sector, in civil society. What do we mean by good governance, and how do we actually put targets and goals for governance within individual countries? Equally, the equality, as I said earlier, the gender issues are equally important. But good governance now is probably the theme that is most pervading some of the discussions, basically.
So,
Thank you. It sort of goes round in a bit of a circle, the governance question to the profit comment earlier. And I just had an observation around how much need there is for structural change in the way companies are required to report. So specifically, I mentioned earlier, I'm a chartered accountant. So under the Companies Act in New Zealand, the directors of companies are required to act in the best interests of the company and the shareholders. The Financial Reporting Act requires them to report in a particular way under IFRS or New Zealand GAAP. And what that basically means right now is profit, loss, and balance sheet. So you have this interesting situation where theoretically it may be in the best interests of a long-term investment to actually take lower profits now. But that's actually open to challenge by shareholders, and in fact has been in New Zealand, where shareholders have taken actions against directors. So that means, I think, there needs to be a structural change in that way. The second, so I'd appreciate your comments on that. The second thing was just around the spatial stuff. Originally I'm from Birmingham. I moved to New Zealand. I was based in Auckland for 6 years, and I've just moved to Dunedin. And one of the interesting things, I think, is the difference between top-down and bottom-up. So in the UK, if you are not taking a top-down approach, does that mean that, and it's similar here actually, you have too much concentration of population in London and the surrounding areas, and here it's Auckland. So in Auckland, we've just announced $1 billion or $2 billion on building more infrastructure. And in Wellington, I think there's a big discussion over a flyover. Whereas actually there's a whole bunch of the country which has got plenty of infrastructure that's underutilized. And so therefore, should you not have a top-down approach in that particular way? So that's the question.
No, they're good questions. I mean, personally speaking, I think for companies, they should not only report on the financial situation, but they should report on their environmental footprint, on their social footprint. So they should report on things such as water use. They should report on things such as greenhouse gas emissions. They should report on things that could cause local and regional air pollution. So I do believe that companies should be transparent, not only on their financial viability, but on their environmental viability as well. I think this would be a major step forward of transparency in the way a company operates and the implications of the way the company operates on the environment. And it could also come up with a number of social indicators as well. So I like the idea, and I think what one should do is we should need government talking with the private sector, talking with the civil society of what is a reasonable amount of reporting that would be required that's not too onerous, but it does give transparency into those particular companies. Then one can see, are we moving in the direction of environmental sustainability or not? On the spatial planning issue, I'm not an expert at all on this, and I haven't even given very much thought to it. I'm not sure there's anything really wrong with what I call the concentration of populations in cities like London. In fact, many economists would argue this is the most efficient way of providing resources for a population. That, in other words, when you've got high densities of people, it's much easier to provide the infrastructure, the roads, the energy, the IT, the water, both in water quality and in sanitation, than if you've got a highly distributed population. So many economists, as I understand it, would argue that we should have high-density cities. It's effectively a way of having efficient use of resources. To me, I think one wants to make use of both the rural area as well as the city area, basically. And I don't think one would want everybody to come to London. It's already got 10 plus million people. However, it is an efficient way. What I would simply argue, within cities like London, we need to make sure they're sustainably, socially sustainable. I've just spent 4 weeks in Melbourne, which is rated as the #1 city in the world from a sustainability aspect. I really liked it. Lots of green space, lots of thinking about how to make sure it's socially sustainable as well as being a vibrant economic city, basically. So where we've gone wrong in lots of places in England is we've got rid of our parks, we've got rid of much of our allotments where people could actually, if they don't have their own garden, could grow their food. I think we have to rethink how to make sure there's adequate green space within our cities. London actually is quite a green city. Washington, D.C., where I live now, is actually viewed, if you use the definition of a forest under the Climate Convention, Washington, D.C. is a forest. It's actually interesting the way they've defined a forest. So I think our challenge is not do we want to spread everyone out equally, but how within cities do you make them socially sustainable?
Question over here.
You talked about earlier the agricultural assessment, and everybody over the last couple of days has talked a lot about collaboration. And you said that there were a few issues that were sort of ideologies and might have been a little bit intractable. I don't want to take you back to too much of a traumatic time in your life, but could you tell us a little bit about your experience with that and how you navigated that, and whether you ended up just parking issues or whether you found a way through it?
Yeah, it was the most interesting assessment I've ever managed to direct and pseudo-chair. It was, as I said, I put first before we started it, I wanted to make sure it was going to be demand-driven. So before even starting the agricultural assessment, I had 9 consultations around the world, each one with 100 different people in, with government representatives, scientists, people from the private sector and NGOs. So 6 of those consultations were in developing countries, 3 were in developed countries, one in North America, 2 in Europe. So to make sure, was this a logical thing to do? In the end, everyone felt it was important. First of all, many people thought we should just look at the science and technology. Luckily, many people said, no, the challenge in agriculture has almost got nothing to do with science and technology. It's issues of trade, it's issues of rural development, etc. And they were absolutely right. So that's why it's called the International Assessment of Agricultural Science and Technology for Development, but within a knowledge framework. So we're well beyond science and technology. We went to knowledge. We had a multi-stakeholder bureau, as I said. The 3 big issues were GMOs, trade, and agrochemicals. And it was one of the most difficult social experiments I've ever tried in my life. Because every time an issue like GMOs came up, or trade, agricultural chemicals, one side or the other felt that it was favouring one type of sector or another. So at one stage, the environmentalists threatened to walk out because they said, you're being way too proactive and positive on GMOs and trade. A few months later, we had the private sector threaten to walk out because they thought we were being too negative on GMOs and trade and pesticides. Some of the governments were somewhat unhappy at times. And there was an incredible social tension all the way through. Much of it was fully agreed, although lots of debate of whether we were focusing on small-scale farmers, smallholder farmers, which is crucial in developing countries. So it was the most difficult assessment I've ever been associated with. In the end, and it was an intergovernmental process, which I declared to be intergovernmental without ever getting the United Nations to agree with me. So it became an intergovernmental process by default. It could never be done again. But I got 7 big international agencies. So I got the World Health Organization, UNEP, UNESCO, WMO, the World Bank, all to be sponsors which made it somewhat intergovernmental, had senior government officials came to the plenaries, as I say, but I short-circuited the UN system in New York. At the end of the day, 3 countries refused to ratify and sign off on the report: the United States, Canada, and Australia. Why? It was around issues of GMOs. The US thought we were way too negative on GMOs. The trade issue was we've really got to get rid of subsidies. We've really got to recognize that we really have to look at the tariff system across trade. So we were very, very strong on how to have major trade reform, which is really hurting developing countries build their agricultural sector. And there were some issues around pesticides where the US didn't think we were sort of open enough about how good pesticides were. But it said to me we did it the right way. We had the stakeholders at the table. And the funny thing is now, much of the private sector rather likes that report. The World Bank absolutely panned the report when we finished, even though I was chief scientist of the World Bank at the time. There was a firewall between me chairing the international assessment and being the chief scientist of the World Bank. But they actually hated the report. And the reason is, we actually argued that smallholder farmers were central to agricultural productivity in sub-Saharan Africa and places of Asia. They hoped the report would say we should go to scale, big farms like in America. Culturally, there's no way that will happen in Africa. The World Bank has now bought into the fact that small-scale farmers are the key to success in Africa and parts of Asia. So our document was used as absolutely anti-intellectual to start with. Most of the things we've said have now been agreed to and are actually pushing forward of how to look at these issues. So it's good to have a social process where there's tension, although it was a very tense situation at times. But I think it was the most successful assessment at the international level I worked on, even though we never had everyone on board. It brought the contentious issues right to the fore. We didn't hide them, we discussed them, basically. The problem with that report is if you listen to me give a talk on it and you listen to one of the co-chairs, Hans Herren, you might think we're talking about 2 different reports. And the reason is he stressed certain things in it, and I try to put a very balanced things on GMOs, the pluses and the minuses, the issues around trade, the issues around pesticides. Hans is absolutely anti-GMOs, absolutely anti-pesticides. And so when you listen to Hans, I'm not saying he's wrong, it's just you do sometimes get a slightly different perspective of Hans that was the science co-chair and I was the director. So it's all in the report, and so he focused on one part of the report. Hopefully I was a fraction more balanced across the report. So, you know, they're tricky to put these reports together and then honestly and dispassionately say what the report said.
I understand that USAID has moved a long way too and are now embracing smallholder farmers. So maybe the US foreign policy position has moved as a result.
It's totally changed. Australia, Canada, and the US are also worried that while the people that represented them at the assessment may have agreed with us on the trade issue, they didn't want to be bound by what we said on trade and trade reform.
Thank you. First of all, it never fails to amaze me how Costanza et al. Keeps living on. And since I was part of the et al. Responsible for wetlands and coral reefs, any questions? My way. We've moved on, though, 16 years later since that. It's very much about the interlinkages and the interconnections between those categories of ecosystem services. It's also very much about the multi-scale aspect of it. Yeah, so the local, the regional, the national, and then the global. That's where my question's going. But I want to take the opportunity to also say, great, James, you just got the job of putting together this National Ecosystem Service Assessment, I think, from which we can then develop a proper plan. Now let's move to that global level where we, of course, want to pick your brain. And here's my question to you. Well, maybe I should preamble it a little bit. We've got the system of national accounting, right? Since 1953, Bretton Woods, all good. We have a system in place. The UN has been working for the last 15 years or so on a system for environment economic accounting as well. And it's very much based on that ecosystem services approach. Yeah? And so what are the chances? What is needed? I mean, I hear you have a lot of experience with putting stakeholder processes together in that assessment space. What are the chances that we're going to do that? So we do get an environment economic accounting system that counterweighs that system of national accounting that we have, and that employs millions of people around the world to keep doing the same thing. And your experience would be appreciated.
I mean, I think what you're inferring, and I might have missed the point, and if so, come back and say you've missed the point completely, Bob, is GDP is a totally flawed concept. It measures economic activity. It's got nothing to do with sustainable economic activity. And in fact, when I first moved to the World Bank from the White House, and this would have been in 1996, so 15 years ago, the World Bank was doing a lot of work on the wealth of a nation, which was indeed looking at the 4 forms of capital: built capital, natural capital, human capital, and social capital. The bank would now argue there's 5 forms of capital, and you would add to it financial capital. And there was a lot of discussion at Rio Plus 20 last year that we've got to go beyond GDP. Doesn't say we get rid of GDP as a measure of economic activity, but we've got to at least complement it with other forms of capital, because it is quite clear that many countries, if you only look at GDP, look like they're doing very well. But in reality, when you start to unfold it, they're actually depleting their natural assets at such a rate that in reality, they're undermining the very stock of what gives them their GDP, some of their GDP in the first place. I'm actually optimistic that we're at the right stage to try and get most countries around the world to at least be thinking about their economic activity by using the different forms of capital. In other words, complementing GDP by GDP plus of the various forms of wealth. And then the crucial issue, there's no perfect right and wrong answer, to what degree is one form of capital fungible to another form of capital? So if you've got natural resources and you use them, is it okay to deplete them or not? Is it okay if you actually then use them to build social capital and human capital, which is probably the single most important thing for any country in the world, is human capital, and invest also in built capital? And it's called weak and strong sustainability. And so I think there is a debate to be had at the national level of to what degree can you deplete a natural resource. And I actually don't find personally a problem in depleting oil or coal, one of those resources, and using that income for human capital and social capital and even built capital. I think one has to look far more when you've got things like forests and water about depleting those. I think that's a much trickier issue, and I would argue should not be depleting those. So I think we're on the brink of at least rethinking how we might look at economic sustainability and economic growth. Whether we'll get there is another question, because the key is we have to convince the macroeconomists in the world, in the treasury departments, in each government, and most macroeconomists don't really take much account of either behavioral economics or environmental economics.
Can I put out, since I'm in the business of putting out challenges in the last few days, can I put one out for you too? One of those, a world ecosystem assessment, like the type with including the valuation and the spatial aspect. We can do a much better job now, and in fact there are some projects already done where we simulate the differences between countries and where what is best done based on those 4 capitals.
Yeah.
And that's really the next frontier. Then the whole scale can be accessed from local all the way to global. Thank you.
I spend a month a year in Monash University. I've just done it. I've only been there once. I think they've just done something that New Zealand and every other country in the world should do. And that is, about a year ago, the Australian government put together a national sustainability council. John Thwaites, who was once a mayor of Melbourne, or South Melbourne, and he then became the Deputy Premier of the state of Victoria, became the chair. They had some real business leaders on this council. They worked very, very closely with the appropriate government departments. And they came up and they actually asked themselves, to what degree is Australia sustainable? And they used the different forms of capital as their basis for analysis. So they looked at built capital, they looked at human and social capital together, and they looked at natural capital. I think they had 15 indicators in the end. They looked at what the trends in all of those 15 indicators were, and they looked, and then they asked themselves the question, where are we today? They then asked the additional question of where are we heading? If you looked at face value of where they are today, it's probably the best country in the world. Now, I know New Zealand wouldn't want to hear that, basically, but it really was. Three of the most livable cities in the world are in Australia: Melbourne, Sydney, and Adelaide. They're first or second on the Human Development Index, depending how you look at the Human Development Index. Their life expectancy, their educational status, absolutely superb. Everything looks good at the moment, but inequality was growing larger between the richest and the poorest. They were starting to deplete their natural resources because they depend on mining and on agriculture, not totally dissimilar to some aspects of New Zealand. They also found that even though human health, the life expectancy had grown 10 years in the last 30, and that a 50-year-old today has more adverse health effects than a 50-year-old 10 or 20 years ago, diabetes, health issues, so living longer, but not in such good health. And also their economic gains had been huge productivity gains in the 70s and 80s and 90s, but in the 20s, their productivity gains had started to go down, and it was only terms of trade, primarily with China, that were good. And so it said, we, Australia, are in a good position today, but boy, if you look at the trends, we're going to have to change the way we do business. So I think the sort of way they looked at sustainability in Australia, and if you couple it with the sort of thing we did on National Ecosystem Assessment, putting those two things together, I would say would really give a country a really good view of where are they going and to what degree it's sustainable or not, what new policies have to come in, how do you get all the stakeholders to find out what is their different roles.
Thank you. I'm sorry, we've got time just for one more question, so
maybe
I'm going to go over here.
Kia ora. My question, and I guess a lot of commentary this last 2 days has been around science. And I think one of the challenges in New Zealand is that we actually lack public good science, and that a lot of science has been captured by commercial interests and by the ideologies of the government of the day. And I think for us to be able to go forward, we're going to need really good public science, and we're going to have to trust it. When you have the CEO of Nestle coming out and saying that there is no human right to water, and he is a major player in the sustainable development of the world, how can you trust that? And so what is your recommendation about how can a small country like New Zealand, with the academic institutes that we have, relying mostly on commercial investment and those commercial investors only really want to hear what they want to hear. And I'd have to say that sometimes the government only really wants to hear what they want to hear as well. So I'd like to ask your advice on how we go forward.
I think that publicly funded research, natural sciences, social sciences, and economics is absolutely vital. And it must be funded by government, but independent of government. The Haldane Principle in the UK says we need to fund publicly funded research in universities, etc. But the research councils, and there's 7 of them, Natural Environment Research Council, there's a Medical Council, there's an Economic and Social Council, there's a Human and Arts Council, there's the Engineering and Physical Sciences, and there's at least one more. These are given money by the government, but they're independent of the government of how to spend that money. So the Chief Scientific Advisor in the UK and the Science Minister have a specific role to advocate for a large share of the budget go into research, but they then don't control it. So I think publicly funded research is absolutely vital, to be quite honest, and it mustn't be censored by governments at all. It's absolutely crucial. Now, a small country, clearly like New Zealand, will never have the ability to have a research program such as, say, the United States. I used to work in the White House. The budget I had meta control over, not small scale, and this was back in 1993, so literally 20 years ago. The total budget, public budget, in the United States was $75 billion a year. The part I oversaw, purely the environmental part, was $7 billion a year 20 years ago. Absolutely vital, basically. But what New Zealand can do is say, what are the crucial issues to New Zealand? And this is where we need to put our money. On some of the big climate issues, one can use the international science community, some of the really large-scale modelling. What New Zealand needs to do then is, how do I do a downscaled model of how, at the regional level in New Zealand, climate will change within New Zealand? It doesn't have to do the big mega models that we've got in the US and even in the UK if it doesn't think it can afford it. It can say, fine, I need to take these really big models and I need to have the ability to downscale. Obviously, on your own ecological systems, ecosystem, you have to do your own research. The stuff done in America is irrelevant to you. The stuff done in Europe is irrelevant to you. So I would argue that publicly funded research is important. I wouldn't be totally negative on all commercial research. I interacted with the fluorocarbon industry basically until they went out of business. And it was some of their own research that made them go out of business. They were totally different from the tobacco industry. And the reason is they funded research and they wanted to disprove the theory that chlorine and bromine would destroy stratospheric ozone. I managed the US program at the time, as well as chaired the international assessments. So Mario Molina, that came up with the theory of chlorine destroying ozone, he and I and about 10 other scientists were unpaid, and I stress unpaid advisors to the fluorocarbon industry, 19 companies across the world. We knew they were trying to disprove the theory, but what we made sure is they funded the very best research and they couldn't censor the results. And it was their own research that showed how bad chlorine and bromine was. So there's some very good research funded by the private sector. As long as you have the rules, it needs to be peer-reviewed and it mustn't be censored. The tobacco industry was a disaster, basically, in trying to pervert the course of good policy. But not all industrial research is that way. One needs to work hand in glove with the responsible part of the private sector. Some parts of the private sector have done some really, really good work. It isn't all good, nor is all publicly funded research good. So I would not demonize commercial research as long as it's high quality and it meets the same standards as publicly funded research.
That's a great insight. Look, in closing, you crisscross the globe all the time. You've advised and continue to advise presidents, prime ministers. You live and breathe the state of the planet. And it just staggers me that you remain as buoyant and as optimistic as you do. In closing, can you just share with us your thoughts, and perhaps really from a heartfelt place, about the prospects of humanity?
Yes, I am optimistic, but the evidence says I shouldn't be. So I'm going against the very evidence. Since the Rio conference in 1990, the first one, greenhouse gases are going up at the fastest rate ever. The climate is changing at a faster rate than ever. We've lost more biodiversity in the last 20 years than we did the previous 50 years, although the rate of deforestation is starting to slow down. We're still seeing a lot of our soil degradation. Local and regional air pollution is getting better in most places in the OECD world. Water quality is getting better in most OECD countries. Huge challenges still in developing countries. In dealing with climate change, it is a global issue. We need international coordinated action. And as I said earlier, everyone's pointing at each other. Also, some of the private sector wants the status quo. They're making a lot of money out of cheap fossil fuels, so they don't want to change. Many other parts of the business community are advocating for a low-carbon economy. They see opportunities in it, and they also see the dangers of climate change. In biodiversity, while it's a global issue, all action is going to be local. So what will Brazil to do for the Brazilian forest? What will Papua New Guinea do? What will the UK do? What will New Zealand do? I have to stay optimistic, but and I'm going to butcher the quote, and I will now say this is the world, but someone was once asking Winston Churchill about something in America, and his comment was very simple. America will always do the right thing after they've examined every other possibility that was bound to fail. And I think that's where we are on the globe today. I don't think we're stupid enough to go over a cliff edge. However, we are degrading the environment. The time for action is now. There is no question we're not on the right pathway. The policies are not in place. We're not putting the money into the technology we need. However, technology is not the biggest challenge. It is behavior change of both individuals, communities, and government, and the right policies to put together. As I've heard several points, well, regulation should be the last step. I disagree, actually. I don't believe in big government. Appropriate regulation can actually stimulate change in the private sector and change in individual behavior. So it's well-designed policy that is actually important, and as you've heard, it is a level playing field for the business community from one part of the country to another part of the world. So I'm not negative on regulation, but it has to be well designed. And when we finished the National Ecosystem Assessment, I briefed a whole bunch of ministers in the UK, and I went through the first 20 slides, and they really gobbled it up. Before I turned over the page to the very last one, I simply said, you will not like my last slide. It's got a very inconvenient truth for you. And they looked at me, and I paused. I then turned it over, and I said very simply, there's not a single environmental issue at scale or social issue that's ever been solved without the right combination of regulations, financial incentives, and behaviour change. You need all three. And the UK government at the time was broke, still is, so it didn't have a lot of money for financial incentives. It doesn't like regulation particularly. It's not anti-regulation, but it's certainly not pro-regulation, so they're not. So it believed in behaviour change, and my point to them was behaviour change is largely stimulated at scale by regulations and by financial incentives. And you need all three, but they have to work together, and they have to, each of them, be very well designed. And so to move forward, we need to think, we should not be anti-regulation, we should think through very carefully what is appropriate to regulate and how to regulate, what's appropriate for financial incentive, and how do you stimulate behaviour change.
Fantastic. That's a great note to end on, and it sounds like that nicely supports a partnership between communities, business,
Exactly.
and government.
Exactly.
Last thing left is just to thank you very much.
Thank you, Sir Robert. Thank you, James. This workshop was the penultimate activity in this event for the last 2 days. As the final activity, I'd invite everyone to rise and join the choir from Wellington East Girls College in singing the national anthem. Thank you, choir. Thank you, everyone, for making it a great conference. Travel well, those of you that are going some distance. Good evening.